Humans. Once they walked the stars, masters of every battlefield. Their enemies spoke of them in whispers, as if naming them would summon destruction. It had been centuries since humanity fought alongside the Galactic Council. Their fleets, once the scourge of every war zone, had faded into legend. Some said Earth had grown soft, content in isolation. But now, with the Krallians tearing through sector after sector, the Council had no choice but to seek Earth's aid. The Council chamber was tense. Representatives of a dozen species sat in silence, all eyes fixed on the holo projection of the incoming Krallian fleet. Their forces were outmatched. Even with their combined might, victory seemed impossible. "We are desperate," Admiral Korvik, a burly, four-armed Tarkanian, growled. His voice echoed off the chamber walls. "Every fleet we've sent has been wiped out. The Krallians will reach the core systems in less than a cycle." Murmurs of fear rippled through the chamber. The Krallians showed no mercy. They slaughtered civilians, destroyed planets, and left nothing but ashes in their wake. "We've contacted Earth," another counselor said, her tone uncertain. "They've agreed to send reinforcements." The room fell silent. For a moment, there was hope. Earth. Humanity. If even a fraction of the stories about their prowess were true, they might stand a chance. Admiral Korvik leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "What fleet have they sent?" The doors to the chamber hissed open and a tall human ambassador entered, dressed in a simple black uniform. His face was unreadable, calm, as if the weight of the galaxy's survival didn't rest on his shoulders. He approached the center of the room and stood before the council. "Earth has sent a ship," he said simply. Korvik frowned, his excitement fading. "A ship?" The ambassador nodded. "The Rusty." There was a beat of silence, then chaos. Counselors erupted in protest, shouting over one another. "The Rusty? What was this? A joke? A relic?" One of them shouted. "You're sending us a relic to face the Krallians? We need an armada, not a museum piece." Another yelled. The ambassador remained impassive. "The Rusty is sufficient." "Sufficient?" Korvik spat. "We're fighting an unstoppable armada and you send us a single dilapidated warship? How is this sufficient?" The ambassador's calm gaze swept across the room. "Humanity has faced worse." The chamber grew quiet again, but the tension was palpable. The ambassador's words did little to ease the council's doubt. But there was no time to argue. The Krallians were coming, and they had to prepare. Korvik finally spoke again, his voice low and menacing. "If your ship fails, human, it won't just be our people who die. Your kind will share the same fate." The ambassador met his gaze steadily. "Then we won't fail." The council watched in silence as the human turned and left, his footsteps echoing through the vast chamber. Outside the windows of the council chamber, in orbit around the council's capital planet. It was massive, yes, but old. Its hull was pockmarked with scars from past battles, its once gleaming exterior now dull and worn. To those watching, it was a relic, a forgotten piece of history. But it was the last hope of the galaxy. Korvik stared out at the Rusty from the war room, fists clenched. "This is what we're relying on." A communications officer glanced over nervously. "The humans have always been unpredictable, sir." "Unpredictable," Korvik muttered. "Let's hope that works in our favor." The Krallians would arrive in less than a cycle. Every second counted. The council mobilized their fleets, preparing for what they expected to be a last stand. But all eyes remained on the Rusty. Would it truly be enough? Or had humanity's arrogance sealed the fate of them all? As the countdown to battle began, doubt gnawed at the minds of every commander, every soldier, and every counselor. But the humans didn't flinch. They watched in silence, their faith in the old warship unshaken. The Rusty was ready, and so were they. All ships hold position. The order echoed through the council fleet. The Allied Armada, an impressive collection of ships from various species, hovered in formation, their weapon systems primed for the incoming enemy. But their commanders' gazes weren't focused on their own fleets. They were fixed on the Rusty, drifting alone toward the horizon, a solitary figure against the endless stars. Korvik's claws drummed against the arm of his chair as he watched the human ship. Are they really going to engage alone? The comm officer nodded. The Rusty has ordered all other fleets to stand down. Korvik's fists tightened. He wasn't a coward, but this was madness. The Kralian fleet was a force of nature, a wall of destruction that no single ship could survive. And yet here was this ancient, outdated vessel charging toward it like a fool rushing into the jaws of death. "Incoming transmission," the officer said. The view screen flickered to life, revealing the sneering face of a Kralian commander. His armor glistened under the harsh lights of his bridge, and his eyes glinted with malicious glee. "Is this humanity's grand return to the stars?" he mocked, gesturing to the Rusty on his screen. "One decrepit ship? How the mighty have fallen." On the human ship, the captain's voice crackled over the comms. "Last chance to turn back, Kralian, or we'll scrap your fleet for parts." Laughter echoed across the channel. "You can barely keep your own shit together, human. What hope do you have against us?" Korvik held his breath, waiting for the human to respond. But there was nothing. Only silence. Then, with terrifying speed, the Rusty moved. Its thrusters ignited, propelling the warship forward with a burst of power that belied its appearance. The first Kralian ships opened fire, beams of energy and missiles streaking toward the Rusty. The Allied fleets tensed, watching in horror as the ancient vessel faced the storm alone. But the Rusty didn't falter. Shields flared to life, absorbing the onslaught with ease. In response, the ship's weapon systems hummed, and in an instant, it unleashed a barrage of plasma fire. The Kralian ships that had dared to challenge it disintegrated, torn apart by the sheer force of the human firepower. The laughter on the Kralian commander's face died. The Kralian commander's grin faltered as his ships crumbled under the heavy barrage from the Rusty. His confidence, once so unshakable, evaporated in an instant. "Impossible," he snarled. "How can that relic still?" The comms cut off as the command ship shuddered, the blast wave of an exploding Kralian frigate slamming into its shields. The Rusty moved like a predator, its guns tracking targets with precision, cutting down Kralian ships before they could react. Korvik stood, eyes wide. How? No one answered. The view screen filled with the carnage. The Kralians, who had destroyed every fleet in their path, were being systematically dismantled. The Rusty's weapons, outdated by modern standards, were somehow tearing through the most advanced shields the galaxy had ever seen. Korvik leaned closer to the screen. "Get me a status report on that ship." "How are they doing this?" "They're using adaptive shielding," a technician muttered. "And their weapon systems appear to be retrofitted with some sort of energy disruption technology. It's like their guns are calibrated to bypass standard Kralian defenses." "Retrofits?" Korvik repeated, incredulous. "They've rebuilt an old ship to counter the Kralians specifically." "That's what it looks like," the technician replied, eyes glued to the data streaming across his console. "Their shields are absorbing the energy of incoming fire and redirecting it into their weapons." Korvik's stomach twisted. The humans had built a weapon specifically designed to tear apart the most feared fleet in the galaxy. And they'd done it without any fanfare or boasting, sending a single ship to the front lines while everyone else had been scrambling to build an armada. On the battlefield, the Kralians were now fully aware of their mistake. Panic rippled through their ranks. Ships broke formation, trying to retreat from the Rusty's wrath. But it was too late. The ancient vessel pursued them relentlessly, tearing through their forces like a scythe through dry grass. The Kralian commander reappeared on the comms, his voice a desperate roar. "Fall back! All ships, fall back!" Korvik almost pitied him. Almost. But then the human captain's voice cut through the static again. Too late for that. With brutal efficiency, the Rusty accelerated, firing salvo after salvo. Krallian cruisers, once the terror of 100 worlds, exploded one after another, their wreckage scattering into space. The command ship, now in full retreat, was the last to fall. Its engines went dark, a final torpedo from the Rusty tearing it apart in a flash of light. The battle was over. Korvik slumped into his chair, still reeling from the impossibility of what he'd just witnessed. Around him, his crew sat in stunned silence. "They did it!" the comm officer breathed. Korvik nodded, his mind struggling to keep pace. He'd thought the humans had been reckless, arrogant even, to send one old warship to face the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. But now, he saw the truth. They hadn't needed an armada. They'd had everything they needed in that one ship. As the Rusty drifted back toward the Allied fleet, Korvik found himself staring at the human vessel with something he hadn't felt in years: awe. Back in the Galactic Council chamber, the mood was one of stunned disbelief. The representatives watched the live feed of the battle's aftermath, their expressions ranging from shock to outright bewilderment. "How could one ship?" a counselor began, but the words died in his throat. The human ambassador sat calmly, hands clasped in his lap. He'd barely moved since the battle began, his face showing no sign of the tension or panic that had gripped everyone else. As the silence in the chamber grew heavier, he finally spoke. "The Rusty is an old ship," he said, his voice steady. "But it was designed for situations exactly like this. Humanity's wars have always been fought against impossible odds. This was just another fight." Admiral Korvik entered the chamber, his face still pale from what he had witnessed. He approached the ambassador slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" The ambassador inclined his head slightly. "We were prepared." "Prepared?" Korvik's voice was sharp, disbelief lacing his words. "You sent a single ship, told us to stand down, and then you annihilated the Krallians like they were nothing. How did you know your ship would be enough?" The ambassador smiled faintly. "It wasn't about knowing, Admiral. It was about understanding our enemy. The Krallians have superior numbers, advanced technology, and overwhelming force. But they lack adaptability. Their tactics, their formations, everything about them is predictable." Korvik's jaw tightened. "And you adapted." "That's what humans do," the ambassador said, his voice calm. "We adapt. We study. We build what we need, not to impress, but to survive." The council chamber was utterly silent, the weight of the ambassador's words sinking in. The other species had tried to match the Krallian ship for ship, technology for technology. The humans had taken a different approach, an approach no one else had considered. A frail-looking counselor who had been silent throughout the entire discussion finally spoke. "And what of the Krallian fleet now? Have you destroyed them entirely?" The ambassador leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "We crippled their main offensive. They'll think twice before returning, but they're not finished. There will be skirmishes, attempts to regroup. But they've lost their momentum." The counselor nodded slowly, her eyes lingering on the screen showing the smoldering remains of the Krallian fleet. Korvik's fists clenched. "You toyed with us?" he accused, his voice thick with frustration. "You knew what that shit could do, and you let us doubt you, question your commitment." The ambassador turned to Korvik, his gaze steady. "We never said the Rusty wouldn't be enough. You assumed it wouldn't be." Korvik opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He knew the ambassador was right. From the moment the Rusty had arrived, every species in the council had judged it by its appearance by their own standards. They had dismissed it as a relic, an outdated piece of technology, without ever considering that it might be exactly what they needed. The ambassador stood, straightening his uniform. "In war, it's easy to get caught up in appearances. To think that bigger and newer is always better. But humans have never fought that way. We don't rely on brute force alone. We rely on adaptability, on strategy. That's why the Rusty was enough." With that, the ambassador began to leave the chamber. He paused at the door, turning back one last time. "Never judge a book by its cover," he said quietly, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. And with that, he was gone. The counselors sat in silence, the weight of the lesson sinking in. They had doubted the humans, doubted their methods, and yet, in the end, it was the humans who had saved them all. As Korvik stared at the empty doorway where the ambassador had stood, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the humans for their resilience, their ingenuity, and their ability to turn the tide of battle with nothing more than a single, rusty old ship.